The bells of Moscow's churches rang out across the frozen landscape on August 25th, 1530, announcing the birth of a prince who would reshape Russia forever. In the ornate chambers of the Kremlin, Yelena Glinskaya, wife of Grand Prince Vasily III, gave birth to a son who would be named Ivan Vasilievich. The infant's cries seemed to echo with an unusual intensity, as if foretelling the tempest his life would become. Vasily III had waited decades for an heir. His first marriage to Solomonia Saburova had been barren for 20 years, and when he finally divorced his wife to marry the young Lithuanian princess Yelena, it had scandalized the Orthodox Church and the boyar nobility. The divorce violated centuries of Orthodox tradition, but Vasily was desperate for a son to continue the Rurikid dynasty that had ruled Moscow for generations. The marriage to Yelena was a calculated risk that would have profound consequences for the infant now crying in the royal chambers. From his earliest days, young Ivan was surrounded by the trappings of absolute power. The Kremlin's towering walls enclosed a world of golden domes, magnificent palaces, and ancient traditions. The fortress had become the beating heart of an expanding realm that stretched from the Arctic seas to the Crimean steppes. Yet beneath the surface lay constant intrigue. The boyars, the hereditary nobles who had once ruled their own principalities, chafed under Moscow's growing centralization. They watched the infant prince with a mixture of reverence and calculation, already planning how they might influence or control him. The child was born into a world of contradictions. Moscow in 1530 was simultaneously the heir to Byzantine orthodoxy and a rising European power. Italian architects were rebuilding the Kremlin in Renaissance style, while Orthodox monks maintained traditions unchanged since the fall of Constantinople. The city's wooden houses clustered around stone churches, and its markets buzzed with traders from as far away as Persia and England. This was the world Ivan would inherit, a realm balanced precariously between East and West, between ancient tradition and modern ambition. Ivan's father, Vasily III, was a man who embodied these contradictions. Deeply religious, yet ruthlessly pragmatic, he had continued the work of his father, Ivan III, in gathering the Russian lands under Moscow's rule. He surrounded himself with scholars and architects, bringing Renaissance influences from Italy while maintaining Russia's orthodox traditions. But his health was failing, and he knew his time was limited. The birth of an heir gave him hope that his life's work would continue. But it also meant that a child would someday inherit the complex and dangerous world he had created. The young prince's earliest memories would be of ceremonies and rituals that emphasized his divine appointment. He was baptized in the cathedral of the Dormition, where the metropolitans of Moscow were buried and where future tsars would be crowned. The holy water touched his infant forehead in the same cathedral where his ancestors had received God's blessing to rule. Even as a baby, Ivan was surrounded by icons that depicted not just Christ and the saints, but the divine right of kings to rule as God's representatives on earth. Court life revolved around the young prince. Wet nurses chosen from the most prestigious families cared for him, while boyar children were brought to play with him under careful supervision. Every aspect of his upbringing was designed to reinforce his special status. He ate from golden plates, wore robes of silk and fur, and was carried in ceremonies where thousands prostrated themselves before him. This early experience of absolute deference would profoundly shape his expectations of how others should treat him. Even as a toddler, Ivan displayed characteristics that would define his adult personality. His nurses whispered about his piercing stare and his tendency to sudden rages when crossed. He would throw himself on the floor in spectacular tantrums if denied anything, but could also display unusual cunning for his age, manipulating adults to get what he wanted. Some courtiers saw in him the marks of future greatness, others detected something darker. The boy seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of the power dynamics around him, watching the adults with calculating eyes that seemed far too mature for his age. The court astrologers, consulted at his birth, had made ominous predictions. They spoke of a ruler who would expand Russia's borders beyond all imagination, but would also bring terrible suffering to his people. Some saw in the alignment of the stars at his birth signs of greatness, others detected the influence of malevolent planets that would drive him to madness and cruelty. As Ivan took his first steps through the marble halls of the Kremlin, none could have imagined how prophetic those words would prove to be. The child's education began early, with Orthodox priests teaching him to read using psalters and religious texts. But Vasily also ensured that his son learned about statecraft and military tactics. Even at age 2, Ivan was shown maps of the realm he would inherit, and toy soldiers were used to teach him about warfare. The message was clear. He was being prepared not just to rule, but to expand and defend the growing Russian state through any means necessary. Tragedy struck the young prince when he was just 3 years old. Vasily III, while on a hunting expedition in late 1533, developed a severe infection on his thigh that quickly spread through his body. What began as a minor wound became a festering mass of corruption that no physician could heal. Within days, the robust ruler was on his deathbed, his flesh rotting from what appeared to be blood poisoning. As he lay dying, delirious with fever and pain, Vasily appointed a regency council to rule until Ivan came of age, with his wife Yelena as the boy's primary guardian. The death of Vasily III plunged Moscow into immediate crisis. The boyar families, who had been kept in check by his strong hand, now saw opportunity in the power vacuum. The Regency Council was supposed to include 7 trusted nobles, but almost immediately factions began forming. Some supported Yelena's regency, while others plotted to remove her and control the young prince directly. The Shuisky family, one of the most powerful boyar clans, began positioning themselves for a takeover, while Yelena's own relatives, the Glinskys, fought to maintain their influence. For 4-year-old Ivan, his father's death meant the loss of the one person who had seemed all-powerful and protective. The boy was too young to understand the political implications, but he could sense the change in atmosphere. Courtiers who had once approached him with reverent smiles now whispered in corners and looked at him with calculating expressions. The child who had never known uncertainty suddenly found his world becoming unstable and threatening. Yelena Glinskaya proved to be a remarkably capable regent. Despite being only in her 20s and facing constant opposition from the boyar families, she managed to maintain control of the government for nearly 5 years. She continued her late husband's policies of centralization, reformed the currency to establish Moscow's control over trade, and even launched successful military campaigns against Lithuania and the Crimean Tatars. But her very competence made her more enemies among the nobles who had expected to dominate a weak female regency. During these years, young Ivan lived in a strange limbo. He was still treated with outward respect as the rightful heir, participating in ceremonies and receiving the formal deference due to a grand prince. But he could sense the underlying tension and barely concealed contempt from many of the boyars. They would bow low when he entered a room, but he caught glimpses of their real expressions when they thought he wasn't looking. The boy began to understand that his power was more symbolic than real, dependent on others who might not always have his best interests at heart. But death had only begun its harvest in the Kremlin. In April 1538, when Ivan was just 8, his mother Yelena collapsed suddenly during a feast. She had been in perfect health that morning, reviewing military dispatches and meeting with foreign ambassadors. By evening, she was writhing in agony, her body convulsing as foam flecked her lips. Within hours, she was dead. Rumors spread like wildfire through Moscow's streets. The young regent had been poisoned. The evidence pointed to assassination. Yelena had been young and healthy, with no history of illness. Her symptoms matched those of arsenic poisoning, and several servants in the royal kitchen disappeared immediately after her death. Whether the poisoning was ordered by ambitious boyars, foreign enemies, or rival family members was never determined. But the message was clear. No one, not even the mother of the rightful heir, was safe from the deadly politics of the Russian court. For 8-year-old Ivan, his mother's death was devastating. Yelena had been his protector and the one person he could trust completely. Now he was truly alone, an orphan surrounded by adults whose loyalty was questionable at best. The boy who had once been the center of elaborate court ceremony now found himself a pawn in the deadly games of the boyar families. He was still formally the Grand Prince, but real power had shifted to the Regency Council, where the most ruthless and ambitious nobles fought for control. The powerful clans, the Schwiskis, the Belskis, the Glinskis, fought viciously for dominance, and young Ivan became both prize and witness to their brutality. He watched helplessly as men who had once knelt before him now treated him with barely concealed contempt. The Schwiski family, led by the ruthless prince Ivan Schwiski, initially gained the upper hand through a combination of political maneuvering and strategic assassinations of their rivals. The Schwiskis treated the young prince with calculated cruelty designed to break his spirit and establish their complete dominance. They would force him to wait for hours in antechambers before granting him audience, as if he were a petitioner rather than their sovereign. They served him meals on dirty plates with spoiled food, claiming that palace resources were limited. When he complained, they would lecture him about the need for humility and patience. Most humiliatingly, they would discuss policy and make important decisions in his presence as if he were invisible, occasionally asking his opinion as a cruel joke before ignoring whatever he said. But Ivan was learning other lessons as well. From his position of enforced powerlessness, He observed how the boyars fought among themselves, how they formed and broke alliances, how they used violence and intimidation to achieve their goals. He studied the mechanisms of power with the intensity of a scholar, watching how the Schwiskis had eliminated their rivals and maintained control through fear and corruption. Each humiliation was filed away in his memory, each slight carefully catalogued for future reckoning. The young prince found solace in books, particularly the Old Testament stories of kings and prophets. He read about David's rise from shepherd boy to king of Israel, about Solomon's wisdom and absolute power, and about the terrible vengeance that God visited upon those who defied his chosen rulers. These stories began to shape his understanding of his own destiny and divine purpose. He began to see himself as a new David, temporarily humbled, but destined for greatness and terrible retribution against his enemies. During the worst periods of boyar control, Ivan would sometimes disappear into the Kremlin's hidden passages and abandoned chambers. The fortress was honeycombed with secret corridors and forgotten rooms, relics of centuries of expansion and reconstruction. There, surrounded by dust and shadows, he would practice giving royal commands to imaginary subjects, rehearsing the day when he would no longer be anyone's victim. His isolation bred both tremendous intellectual development and a growing capacity for methodical cruelty. On January 16th, 1547, in the Cathedral of the Dormition within the Kremlin walls, 16-year-old Ivan Vasilievich underwent a coronation ceremony that would change Russian history forever. Instead of accepting the traditional title of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan insisted on being crowned as Tsar of All Russia, a title that claimed not just temporal power, but spiritual authority as heir to the Byzantine emperors and protector of all Orthodox Christians. The ceremony was magnificent and deliberately crafted to establish Ivan's absolute authority. He wore the cap of Monomakh, the ancient crown supposedly given by Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX to Vladimir Monomakh, and carried the scepter and orb that symbolized dominion over all Orthodox lands. Metropolitan Macarius performed the coronation, anointing Ivan with holy oil and blessing him as God's chosen ruler on earth. The young Tsar had transformed himself from powerless orphan to divinely appointed autocrat in a single ceremony that drew its legitimacy from both Russian tradition and Byzantine imperial precedent. But even as the bells of Moscow rang out in celebration, Ivan was already planning his revenge against those who had tormented him during his minority. His first target was Prince Ivan Schwisky, the boyar leader who had been particularly cruel during the Regency years. In a carefully orchestrated move that demonstrated his newfound power, Ivan ordered Schwisky's arrest during a court ceremony. The once powerful boyar was dragged from the throne room and thrown to a pack of hunting dogs who tore him apart while Ivan watched with cold satisfaction. The message to the remaining boyars was unmistakable. The child they had humiliated was now a man with the power of life and death over them all. The coronation marked more than just Ivan's assumption of power. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Russian monarchy. By taking the title of Tsar, Ivan was claiming to be the successor to the Roman and Byzantine emperors, the protector of Orthodox Christianity, and the absolute ruler of a realm that he intended to expand far beyond Moscow's current borders. This was not merely a political declaration, but a religious one, establishing Ivan as God's representative on earth with unlimited authority over his subjects. In the weeks following his coronation, Ivan moved quickly to consolidate his power and reform the Russian state. He dismissed the remaining members of the Regency Council and appointed his own advisors, many of them drawn from the lower nobility and clergy rather than the great boyar families. This was a deliberate strategy to create a governing class that owed their positions entirely to him rather than to ancient family privileges. The young Tsar also began implementing a series of reforms designed to modernize and strengthen the Russian state. He created the Chosen Council, a small group of trusted advisors, including the priest Sylvester and the courtier Alexei Adashev, who would help him govern more effectively than the fractious boyar assembly. He established new law codes that standardized justice across his realm and reduced the arbitrary power of local nobles. Most importantly, he began creating a professional military force that would be loyal to him personally rather than to regional commanders. But Ivan's early months as Tsar were not without challenges. The boyar families, while cowed by Shuisky's brutal execution, had not abandoned their ambitions. They engaged in subtle sabotage of his policies while maintaining outward loyalty. Foreign enemies, sensing opportunity in the change of leadership, tested Russia's borders. The Crimean Tatars launched raids into Russian territory, while the Kazan Khanate continued to threaten trade routes and Russian settlements along the Volga. The most severe test came in June 1547, when a series of devastating fires swept through Moscow. The Great Fire of 1547 began in the Arbat district and quickly spread throughout the wooden city. Fed by strong winds and the dry summer heat, the flames consumed entire neighborhoods, including parts of the Kremlin itself. Thousands died in the inferno, and much of the capital lay in ruins. The fire was so intense that even stone churches cracked from the heat, and the Moscow River itself seemed to boil from the reflected flames. In the aftermath of the fire, popular discontent erupted into open rebellion. Crowds of angry Muscovites gathered in the Kremlin, demanding answers and someone to blame for the disaster. Rumors spread that the fire had been caused by witchcraft, specifically by Ivan's maternal relatives, the Glinskys, who were accused of using sorcery to maintain their influence over the young Tsar. The mob's anger quickly turned violent, and several members of the Glinsky family were murdered before Ivan could restore order. The fire and its aftermath taught Ivan important lessons about the fragility of power and the need to maintain popular support. He realized that even an absolute monarch could not ignore the will of his people entirely. The young Tsar began to cultivate his image as a pious Orthodox ruler who cared for the welfare of his subjects. He ordered the rebuilding of Moscow with wider streets and more stone construction to prevent future fires, and he established new charitable institutions to care for orphans and widows. But the traumatic events of 1547 also reinforced Ivan's growing paranoia and suspicion of those around him. The rebellion had shown him how quickly popular support could turn to violence, while the behavior of the boyars during the crisis convinced him that they were fundamentally unreliable. He began to see enemies and conspiracies everywhere, a mindset that would only intensify as he grew older and faced greater challenges to his authority. The young Tsar's response to these early crises established patterns that would define his entire reign. He combined genuine reforms aimed at strengthening the state with increasingly brutal suppression of any perceived opposition. He sought to modernize Russia while maintaining absolute personal control over every aspect of government and society. Most ominously, he began to develop the systematic use of terror as a tool of statecraft, using fear and unpredictable violence to keep potential enemies off balance and ensure absolute obedience to his will. In February 1547, just weeks after his coronation, Ivan faced one of the most important decisions of his young reign: choosing a bride. Rather than accepting an arranged marriage with a foreign princess, as was customary for rulers seeking diplomatic alliances, Ivan insisted on selecting his wife from among the daughters of his own nobles. This decision would have profound consequences for both his personal happiness and the future of Russia. The bride show that followed was an elaborate spectacle that demonstrated Ivan's absolute power while also revealing his romantic nature. Hundreds of eligible young women from noble families across Russia were brought to Moscow for the Tsar's inspection. They were housed in the Kremlin and subjected to careful examination by court physicians, priests, and advisors. Ivan interviewed many of them personally, seeking not just physical beauty, but intelligence and character that would make a suitable companion for an absolute monarch. His choice fell upon Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina Yurieva, daughter of a relatively minor boyar family that would later become the Romanov dynasty. Anastasia was renowned for her beauty, with golden hair and striking blue eyes, but what attracted Ivan most was her gentle and intelligent personality. Unlike the calculating women of the great boyar families, Anastasia seemed genuine and unambitious, interested in him as a person rather than as a stepping stone to power. Their wedding on February 3rd, 1547, was celebrated with unprecedented magnificence. The ceremony took place in the Cathedral of the Dormition, with Metropolitan Macarius performing the sacred rites. Ivan wore robes of cloth of gold decorated with precious stones, while Anastasia was dressed in traditional Russian bridal attire with a crown of pearls and diamonds. The festivities continued for days, with elaborate banquets, theatrical performances, and distributions of gifts to the common people of Moscow. The marriage marked a turning point in Ivan's emotional development. For the first time since his mother's death, he had found someone whom he could trust completely and love without reservation. Anastasia's influence on her young husband was immediately apparent. She encouraged his interest in learning and the arts, supported his reform efforts, and served as a moderating influence on his increasingly volatile temperament. Court observers noted that Ivan seemed more stable and less prone to sudden rages when Anastasia was present. The new Tsarina quickly established herself as a beloved figure among the Russian people. She was known for her charitable works, personally visiting hospitals and orphanages, and for her accessibility to common petitioners seeking royal intercession. Anastasia also proved to be an astute political advisor, helping Ivan navigate the treacherous waters of court politics while maintaining the support of the various boyar families. Her Romanov relatives previously minor players in court politics began to rise in influence and importance. But the happiness of Ivan's early marriage was soon tested by catastrophe. In June 1547, just 4 months after the wedding, Moscow was struck by a series of devastating fires that would change the course of Ivan's reign. The Great Fire of 1547 began during an unusually hot and dry summer. Wooden buildings, baked by weeks of intense heat, became perfect tinder for the flames that started in the Arbat district on June 21st. The fire spread with terrifying speed through Moscow's narrow streets and wooden structures. Strong winds carried burning debris from building to building, creating multiple fire fronts that overwhelmed the city's primitive firefighting capabilities. The flames were so intense that they could be seen from villages dozens of miles away, and the smoke darkened the sky for days. Even the stone walls of the Kremlin could not stop the inferno, as burning embers ignited the wooden structures within the fortress. Ivan and Anastasia, along with the entire court, were forced to flee the Kremlin as the fire approached the royal apartments. They took refuge in the village of Vorobyovo, several miles from Moscow, and watched in horror as their capital burned. The young Tsar later described the experience as apocalyptic, comparing it to the biblical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The sight of his capital in flames would haunt him for the rest of his life and contribute to his growing sense that he was surrounded by enemies and conspiracies. The human cost of the fire was enormous. Contemporary accounts suggest that between 2,000 and 4,000 people died in the flames, while tens of thousands were left homeless. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash, including most of the city's wooden churches, markets, and residential areas. The economic damage was catastrophic, as Moscow was not just the political capital, but also the commercial heart of Russia, and its destruction disrupted trade networks throughout the realm. In the aftermath of the fire, popular discontent erupted into violence that directly threatened Ivan's rule. Crowds of angry survivors gathered in Cathedral Square, demanding answers and someone to blame for the disaster. The mood was ugly and revolutionary, with calls for the execution of those responsible for the city's poor fire prevention measures. Some even questioned Ivan's fitness to rule, suggesting that the fire was divine punishment for his sins or incompetence. The situation became even more dangerous when rumors spread that the fire had been caused by witchcraft. Popular superstition focused on Ivan's maternal relatives, the Glinskys, who were accused of removing human hearts, soaking them in water, and sprinkling the cursed liquid on Moscow's streets to start the conflagration. The crowd's anger quickly turned lethal, and Prince Yuri Glinsky, Ivan's uncle, was dragged from a church where he had sought sanctuary and beaten to death by the mob. For Ivan, the rebellion was a traumatic awakening to the realities of absolute power. He realized that even a Tsar could not take popular support for granted, and that divine right meant nothing if his subjects chose to reject his authority. The young ruler was forced to appear before the angry crowd and promise reforms, better governance, and compensation for the fire victims. It was a humiliating experience that reinforced his growing paranoia about enemies both within and outside his government. The Great Fire and its aftermath marked the end of Ivan's political innocence. The idealistic young Tsar, who had hoped to rule through law and justice, now understood that power ultimately rested on force and fear. The trauma of seeing Moscow in flames and facing an angry mob would influence every major decision he made for the rest of his reign, contributing to his evolution from reformer to tyrant. The devastating fire of 1547 and the popular uprising that followed served as a catalyst for Ivan's transformation from a ceremonial monarch into an active reformer. Recognizing that his throne's survival depended on effective governance and popular support, the young Tsar embarked on an ambitious program of modernization that would lay the foundation for Russia's emergence as a major European power. Ivan's first priority was rebuilding Moscow, but he was determined to create a capital worthy of his imperial ambitions. Working with Italian architects who had remained in Russia since his grandfather's time, he planned a new city with wider streets to prevent future fires, more stone construction, and improved water systems. The Kremlin itself was expanded and reinforced with new palaces and administrative buildings that proclaimed Russia's growing power and wealth. But physical reconstruction was only part of Ivan's vision. He recognized that Russia's feudal system of governance, inherited from medieval times, was inadequate for governing an expanding empire. The young Tsar began implementing systematic reforms that would centralize authority in Moscow while creating more efficient administrative and military structures throughout his realm. The cornerstone of Ivan's reforms was the creation of the Chosen Council, an advisory body that replaced the chaotic boyar assembly with a smaller group of competent administrators. Unlike the traditional boyar council, which was dominated by hereditary nobles whose primary qualification was their family lineage, the Chosen Council included talented individuals from various backgrounds. The priest Sylvester provided spiritual guidance and helped draft new legal codes, while Alexei Adashev, a minor nobleman with exceptional organizational skills, became Ivan's chief administrator. Ivan also established the Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land, which brought together representatives from different social classes to advise the Tsar on major issues. This innovation allowed Ivan to gauge public opinion and build support for his policies while maintaining ultimate decision-making authority. The assembly included not just boyars and clergy, but also merchants, minor nobles, and even some representatives from the free peasantry, making it one of the more representative governing bodies in the 16th century Europe. Legal reform was another crucial element of Ivan's modernization program. The Sudebnik of 1550, a comprehensive new law code, standardized legal procedures across the Russian realm and reduced the arbitrary power of local officials. The code established clear penalties for various crimes, outlined proper judicial procedures, and created mechanisms for appeal to higher courts. Most importantly, it affirmed the principle that all Russian subjects, regardless of social status, were equal before the law. A revolutionary concept in a society still organized around feudal hierarchies. Military reform was equally important to Ivan's vision of a modernized Russia. The traditional Russian army depended on feudal levies, where boyars were required to provide troops in proportion to their landholdings. This system produced armies that were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and unreliable in extended campaigns. Ivan began creating a professional military force that would be loyal to him personally rather than to regional commanders or feudal obligations. The centerpiece of military reform was the creation of the Streltsy, a permanent standing army equipped with firearms and organized along professional lines. These soldier musketeers were recruited from the urban population, trained in military camps outside Moscow, and paid regular salaries from the royal treasury. They wore distinctive uniforms, lived in military settlements, and were forbidden to engage in other occupations. The Streltsy represented a fundamental departure from feudal military organization and gave Ivan a reliable force for both external warfare and internal security. Ivan also established new military engineering corps to design and build modern fortifications. Russian cities were surrounded with new, star-shaped bastions designed to withstand cannon fire, while the frontier was protected by lines of fortified settlements that could serve as bases for further expansion. The Tsar imported foreign military experts, particularly from Germany and Italy, to train Russian officers in the latest techniques of warfare and siegecraft. Administrative reform was equally comprehensive. Ivan divided Russia into new territorial units called Oprichniki, each governed by appointed officials who answered directly to Moscow rather than to local boyar families. This system replaced the complex patchwork of feudal jurisdictions with a unified administrative structure that could implement royal policy efficiently throughout the realm. Tax collection was systematized, with new assessments based on land productivity rather than historical precedent. Economic reform accompanied political modernization. Ivan established new trade regulations that favored Russian merchants over foreign competitors, while creating standardized weights, measures, and currency throughout his realm. He founded new markets and trade routes, particularly toward the east, where Russian merchants began establishing commercial relationships with Central Asian and Chinese traders. The Tsar also encouraged the development of manufacturing, particularly metalworking and textile production, to reduce Russia's dependence on imported goods. Religious reform was more delicate, but Ivan recognized the need to strengthen the Orthodox Church as a pillar of his authority. The Stoglav Council of 1551 standardized religious practices throughout Russia, established uniform liturgical texts, and created new educational requirements for clergy. The Church's vast landholdings were partially reorganized to provide more revenue for the state, while maintaining clerical support for the monarchy. Cultural development was not neglected in Ivan's reform program. He established new schools for the education of government officials, expanded the royal library with manuscripts from across Europe and the Byzantine world, and patronized artists and writers who celebrated Russian achievements. The first printing press in Russia was established during this period, making books more widely available and helping to standardize the Russian language. These reforms transformed Russia from a medieval principality into an early modern state, capable of competing with the major powers of Europe and Asia. The centralized administration, professional military, and standardized legal system gave Ivan the tools he needed to expand Russian territory and influence far beyond what his predecessors had achieved. But the concentration of power in the hands of the autocrat also created the potential for unprecedented tyranny if that power were to be abused. By 1550, Ivan's domestic reforms had created the foundation for an aggressive foreign policy that would establish Russia as a major imperial power. His first target was the Khanate of Kazan, a Tatar successor state to the Golden Horde that controlled the vital Volga River trade route and regularly launched devastating raids into Russian territory. The conquest of Kazan would not only eliminate a persistent security threat, but also open the path for Russian expansion into the rich lands of the Volga Basin and beyond. The Kazan Khanate was a formidable opponent, protected by massive stone walls and defended by experienced warriors who had been fighting Russians for centuries. The city of Kazan itself sat on a high bluff overlooking the Volga, surrounded by walls 30 feet high and reinforced with towers and bastions. The Khanate's military forces included not just Tatar cavalry, but also artillery and firearms obtained through trade with the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim powers. Previous Russian attempts to conquer Kazan had failed spectacularly. Ivan's father, Vasily III, had launched multiple campaigns against the city, only to see his armies decimated by disease, logistics failures, and effective Tatar resistance. The most recent expedition in 1549 to 1550 had ended in humiliation when Russian forces were forced to retreat after a failed siege that lasted several months. For Ivan, the conquest of Kazan became both a military necessity and a test of his worthiness as a ruler. Preparation for the Kazan campaign demonstrated Ivan's growing sophistication as a military commander and administrator. Rather than relying on traditional feudal levies, he assembled a professional army built around his new Streltsy regiments and equipped with the latest military technology. Italian and German engineers were employed to design siege equipment specifically for attacking Kazan's fortifications, while logistics specialists organized supply lines that could sustain a lengthy campaign. The army that marched toward Kazan in the summer of 1552 was the largest and best-equipped force Russia had ever assembled. Contemporary sources suggest that Ivan commanded between 100,000 and 150,000 troops, including 20,000 Streltsy armed with arquebuses, thousands of Cossack cavalry, artillery units with modern cannons, and engineering corps trained in siege warfare. The force also included contingents from Russia's client states and allies, including Mordvin and Chuvash warriors who had their own grievances against Tatar rule. Ivan personally led this massive expedition, demonstrating both his courage and his understanding that successful commanders must share the risks of warfare with their soldiers. The young Tsar wore specially designed armor that combined protection with mobility, and he was accompanied by his personal guard of elite Streltsy, who had sworn to die rather than allow their sovereign to be captured or killed. The march to Kazan took several months, as Ivan's army had to transport heavy siege equipment across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The Russians established fortified camps at regular intervals, creating secure supply bases that could support the main army during the siege. This methodical approach showed Ivan's growing maturity as a military leader and his understanding that successful campaigns required careful planning and execution rather than just courage and numbers. The siege of Kazan began in August 1552 and quickly developed into one of the most sophisticated military operations of the 16th century. Russian engineers constructed elaborate earthworks that surrounded the city, preventing any relief force from reaching the defenders while protecting the besiegers from Tatar counterattacks. Batteries of cannons were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that could destroy any section of the city walls. The key to Russian success was the systematic use of mining operations to undermine Kazan's seemingly impregnable fortifications. German and Italian engineers directed the excavation of tunnels beneath the city walls, where enormous charges of gunpowder were planted. These mining operations required weeks of dangerous work, as Tatar defenders attempted to dig countermines to destroy the Russian tunnels before they could be completed. Ivan demonstrated remarkable personal leadership during the siege, regularly visiting the front lines to encourage his soldiers and inspect the progress of the mining operations. He slept in the trenches with his men, shared their rations, and personally directed artillery fire against specific targets in the city walls. This hands-on approach won him the devoted loyalty of his troops and enhanced his reputation as a warrior Tsar who led from the front. The climax of the siege came on October 2nd, 1552, when Russian engineers detonated their mines simultaneously beneath multiple sections of Kazan's walls. The explosions were heard for miles, and contemporary accounts describe how the earth shook as if from an earthquake. When the smoke cleared, huge gaps had been torn in the fortifications, creating multiple breaches through which the Russian army could assault the city. The final assault on Kazan was a masterpiece of coordinated military action. Streltsy units poured through the breaches in the walls, while artillery continued to bombard the city center. Cossack cavalry swept around the city to cut off any escape routes, while engineering units demolished any remaining fortifications that could serve as strong points for the defenders. The fighting was fierce and bloody, but the outcome was never in doubt once the walls had been breached. The fall of Kazan marked a turning point in Russian history and established Ivan's reputation as one of Europe's great military commanders. The conquest eliminated the last major Tatar threat to Russian security while opening the entire Volga River basin to Russian colonization. More importantly, it demonstrated that Russian military technology and organization had reached parity with the major powers of Europe and Asia. Ivan's treatment of the conquered city showed both his capacity for mercy and his understanding of imperial policy. While Tatar resistance fighters were executed or enslaved, civilians who submitted to Russian rule were generally protected and allowed to maintain their property and religious practices. The city was rebuilt as a Russian administrative center, but mosques were allowed to continue functioning alongside new Orthodox churches. The victory at Kazan had profound psychological effects on both Ivan and his subjects. For the Tsar, it confirmed his belief in his divine mission to expand Orthodox Christianity and Russian civilization into new territories. For the Russian people, it demonstrated that their young ruler possessed the military skill and divine favor necessary to overcome their most dangerous enemies. The conquest established Ivan as a national hero and gave him the confidence to pursue even more ambitious military campaigns in the years ahead. The conquest of Kazan in 1552 opened a gateway to the vast territories of the East, and Ivan immediately began planning the next phase of his imperial expansion. The Khanate of Astrakhan, controlling the mouth of the Volga River where it emptied into the Caspian Sea, represented both a strategic prize and a natural next step in Russia's eastward advance. Control of Astrakhan would give Russia complete dominance over the Volga trade route and access to the lucrative commerce of the Caspian region. The Astrakhan campaign of 1556 demonstrated how thoroughly Ivan had learned the lessons of modern warfare. Rather than mounting a costly siege like the one at Kazan, Russian forces used diplomacy, bribery, and psychological warfare to achieve their objectives. The Astrakhan Khanate was weakened by internal divisions and lacked the strong fortifications that had made Kazan such a formidable opponent. When Russian armies approached the city, many of its defenders simply abandoned their positions and fled across the Caspian Sea. The ease of the Astrakhan conquest encouraged Ivan to pursue even more ambitious territorial goals. His attention turned to Siberia, a vast region of forests, rivers, and steppes that stretched thousands of miles eastward to the Pacific Ocean. Initial Russian contact with Siberia had come through the Stroganov family, wealthy merchants who had received permission to establish trading posts beyond the Urals. Their reports described a land rich in furs, minerals, and other valuable resources, but defended only by scattered tribes armed with primitive weapons. The conquest of Siberia began not as a royal expedition, but as a private venture by Cossack adventurers seeking profit and glory. In 1581, a force of fewer than 1,000 Cossacks, led by the legendary Yermak Timofeyevich, crossed the Urals and began the systematic conquest of the Siberian Khanate. These hardy warriors, equipped with firearms and supported by native allies who had their own grievances against Siberian rule, proved remarkably effective against much larger numbers of traditional fighters. Ivan initially viewed the Siberian expedition with skepticism, suspecting that the Cossacks might establish an independent state beyond his control. But when Yermak sent captured Siberian treasures and tributes of valuable furs to Moscow, the Tsar quickly recognized the enormous potential of the eastern territories. He provided official support for the conquest, sending additional troops, supplies, and administrators to consolidate Russian control over the newly conquered lands. The Siberian conquest proceeded with stunning rapidity. Russian forces, using their superior weapons and tactics, defeated Siberian Khan Kuchum and captured his capital city of Kashlik in 1582. The victory opened the entire Ob River basin to Russian colonization and established the foundation for an empire that would eventually stretch to the Pacific Ocean and into North America. Within a generation, Russian trappers, traders, and settlers were establishing fortified posts throughout Siberia, creating a vast network of commerce and administration that rivaled the Spanish conquests in the Americas. The economic impact of Eastern expansion was immediately apparent in Moscow. Siberian furs, particularly the highly prized sable pelts, became one of Russia's most valuable exports to European markets. The tribute system established in conquered territories provided the royal treasury with enormous revenues that funded further military campaigns and domestic development projects. Russian merchants established trade routes that connected Moscow with Central Asian markets, Chinese cities, and eventually with European trading companies seeking direct access to Asian goods. But Ivan's eastern expansion was not limited to Siberia. Russian influence began extending into the Caucasus region, where Georgian and Armenian princes sought protection against Ottoman and Persian pressure. The Tsar established diplomatic relations with these Christian rulers, offering military support in exchange for recognition of Russian suzerainty. This policy created a Russian presence in the strategically important region between Europe and Asia, while extending Orthodox influence into areas that had been dominated by Muslim powers. The expansion into Central Asia also brought Russia into direct contact with major Asian powers, particularly the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Persia. These encounters required sophisticated diplomacy as well as military preparedness. Ivan's ambassadors traveled to Istanbul, Isfahan, and other major Asian capitals, negotiating treaties and trade agreements that established Russia as a recognized power in Asian politics. The Tsar's growing international prestige was demonstrated when European powers began seeking Russian alliance against common enemies, particularly the Ottoman Empire. The administrative challenges of governing such vast new territories required innovative solutions. Ivan established a colonial administration based on fortified trading posts that served as centers of Russian authority in conquered regions. These outposts were typically manned by Cossack garrisons and staffed with Russian officials who collected taxes, administered justice, and organized military defense. The system allowed effective control over enormous distances while requiring relatively modest investments in personnel and resources. Religious policy in the conquered territories reflected Ivan's complex understanding of imperial governance. While Orthodox Christianity was promoted and new churches were built in Russian settlements, conquered peoples were generally allowed to maintain their traditional religious practices as long as they remained loyal to the Tsar. This pragmatic approach helped minimize resistance to Russian rule while gradually extending Orthodox influence through voluntary conversion and intermarriage. The Eastern expansion also had profound effects on Russian society and culture. The wealth flowing from Siberian furs and Asian trade enriched Moscow's merchants and nobles, creating new social classes and economic opportunities. Russian colonists in the Eastern territories developed new skills and attitudes that differed significantly from those of their European counterparts. The experience of governing diverse populations and managing vast distances created administrative expertise that would prove valuable in later imperial expansion. For Ivan personally, the Eastern conquests confirmed his vision of Russia as a great imperial power destined to expand its borders and influence far beyond traditional European limits. The success of Russian arms against Asian opponents demonstrated that his military reforms had created a force capable of competing with any power in the world. The enormous wealth generated by Eastern expansion provided the resources needed for ambitious domestic projects and further territorial conquest. However, the focus on Eastern expansion also created strategic vulnerabilities that Ivan's enemies would eventually exploit. While Russian attention and resources were concentrated on distant Asian territories, European neighbors began planning their own aggressive moves against Russian interests. The Eastern conquests, for all their success and profitability, would ultimately contribute to the military overextension that characterized the later years of Ivan's reign. The year 1560 marked a tragic turning point in Ivan's life and reign. On August 7th, Tsarina Anastasia died suddenly at the age of only 27, leaving Ivan devastated and increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of those around him. Her death came after a brief illness that contemporary physicians could not explain, leading to immediate suspicions of poisoning. The loss of the one person who had provided emotional stability and wise counsel to the volatile Tsar would have catastrophic consequences for Russia and its people. Anastasia's death plunged Ivan into a grief so profound that it fundamentally altered his personality. The woman who had been his anchor to sanity and compassion was gone, and with her went much of Ivan's capacity for trust and mercy. Court observers noted an immediate change in the Tsar's behavior. He became increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, convinced that enemies had murdered his beloved wife and were plotting further betrayals. The paranoid tendencies that had been kept in check during his marriage now flourished unconstrained. Ivan's suspicions focused particularly on the boyar families, whom he had never fully trusted despite the relative harmony of his early reign. He became convinced that jealous nobles had poisoned Anastasia to weaken his rule and return to the chaotic conditions of his minority. The Tsar's accusations grew increasingly wild and unpredictable. He saw conspiracies everywhere, interpreting minor incidents as evidence of major plots against his authority. The loss of Anastasia also removed the primary moderating influence on Ivan's volatile temperament. During their marriage, she had been able to calm his rages and discourage his more extreme impulses. Without her gentle guidance, Ivan's natural inclination toward violence and cruelty began to manifest more frequently and severely. Court sessions that had once been relatively civilized affairs became tense confrontations where the Tsar might suddenly explode in fury over minor disagreements. Ivan's grief expressed itself in increasingly erratic behavior that alarmed even his closest advisers. He would spend days locked in his private chambers, refusing to see anyone or attend to state business. Then he would suddenly emerge and demand immediate action on complex issues, often changing his mind repeatedly and punishing officials for failing to anticipate his shifting desires. His religious devotions became obsessive, as he spent hours praying and reading theological texts, seeking either divine guidance or confirmation of his darkest suspicions. The Tsar's mental state was further destabilized by a series of military and political setbacks that began shortly after Anastasia's death. The Livonian War, which Ivan had launched in 1558 to gain access to the Baltic Sea, initially proceeded well with the Russian forces, capturing several important cities. But by 1560, a coalition of European powers, including Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, had formed to contain Russian expansion. What had begun as a promising campaign became a prolonged and costly conflict that drained Russian resources and manpower. Foreign policy failures were compounded by domestic problems that Ivan increasingly attributed to boyar sabotage and treachery. Crop failures led to food shortages in several provinces, while plague outbreaks decimated populations in key cities. Tax revenues declined as trade disrupted by constant warfare reduced commercial activity. Ivan's response to these challenges was to blame his advisors and administrators rather than acknowledge the role of his own policies in creating the problems. The chosen council, which had provided effective governance during the early years of Ivan's reign, began to fragment under the pressure of the Tsar's increasingly erratic demands. Alexei Adashev, who had been Ivan's most trusted administrator, fell from favor and was banished to a remote fortress where he died under suspicious circumstances. The priest Sylvester, who had served as Ivan's spiritual advisor and helped draft many of his early reforms, was forced into exile at a distant monastery. These dismissals eliminated the last voices of reason and moderation that might have restrained Ivan's worst impulses. Ivan's paranoia extended to his own family and closest associates. He began to suspect that his brother Yuri, his cousins, and even his oldest friends were involved in plots against him. The Tsar established an elaborate network of spies and informers who reported on the activities and conversations of nobles, clergy, and foreign diplomats. No one was above suspicion, and even casual remarks could be interpreted as evidence of treasonous intent. The death of Anastasia also marked the beginning of Ivan's obsession with remarriage, but his subsequent relationships only added to his psychological instability. His second wife, Maria Temryukovna, a Caucasian princess, chosen for political rather than personal reasons, could not replace Anastasia's emotional importance. The marriage was troubled from the beginning, with Maria unable to understand or moderate Ivan's increasingly violent mood swings. Her death in 1569, also under suspicious circumstances, only reinforced Ivan's conviction that enemies were systematically destroying everyone he cared about. Religious advisors who had once been able to counsel Ivan toward Christian mercy and forgiveness found their influence drastically reduced. The Tsar's religious devotions became increasingly focused on Old Testament themes of divine wrath and righteous vengeance rather than New Testament messages of love and redemption. He began to see himself as a new King David, chosen by God to destroy the enemies of the Orthodox faith and the Russian state, regardless of the human cost. Ivan's physical appearance changed dramatically during this period, reflecting his mental deterioration. Once handsome and imposing, he became gaunt and haggard, his hair and beard turning prematurely white. His eyes developed a wild, staring quality that terrified courtiers and foreign ambassadors alike. He began carrying a heavy iron staff that he used both as a walking stick and as a weapon to strike anyone who displeased him. The Tsar's intellectual capacities, which had been considerable in his youth, became increasingly focused on theological studies and historical research that confirmed his growing paranoia. He devoured chronicles of previous Russian rulers, particularly those who had faced internal rebellions and foreign invasions. These readings convinced him that mercy toward potential enemies was weakness that invited further attacks on royal authority. By 1564, Ivan's mental state had deteriorated to the point where effective governance became impossible. His advisors never knew whether they would encounter a rational ruler interested in state business or a raging tyrant ready to order their execution for imaginary crimes. The administrative system that had functioned efficiently during the 1550s began to break down as officials became too frightened to take initiative or report bad news to their increasingly unstable sovereign. The combination of personal grief, military setbacks, and growing paranoia had transformed Ivan from an effective ruler into a dangerous autocrat whose primary concern was eliminating perceived threats to his absolute power. The stage was set for the establishment of the Oprichnina, the reign of terror that would make Ivan's name synonymous with tyranny and cruelty throughout Russian history. In December 1564, Ivan shocked his subjects and the world by abruptly abandoning Moscow without explanation, taking his family and closest advisors to the fortified settlement of Alexandrova Sloboda, 60 miles northeast of the capital. From this retreat, he sent 2 carefully crafted letters that would transform Russia into a state of unprecedented terror. The first letter, addressed to the metropolitan and boyars, accused them of treason and announced his abdication from the throne. The second, sent to the common people of Moscow, assured them of his continued love while blaming the nobility for forcing his departure. The reaction in Moscow was immediate and dramatic. Crowds of ordinary citizens gathered in Red Square, demanding the return of their Tsar and threatening violence against the boyars they held responsible for his departure. Trade ceased, administrative functions collapsed, and rumors spread of impending invasion by foreign enemies who might exploit Russia's apparent political chaos. The boyars, terrified of popular uprising and foreign attack, dispatched urgent delegations to Alexandrova Sloboda, begging Ivan to return and offering to accept any conditions he might impose. Ivan's response revealed the calculated nature of his seemingly impulsive departure. He agreed to return to Moscow, but only if granted absolute authority to punish traitors without interference from the church or nobility, and permission to establish a new administrative system that would give him direct control over selected portions of his realm. This was the birth of the Oprichnina, a parallel state structure that would terrorize Russia for the next 7 years. The term Oprichnina derived from the Russian word oprich, meaning apart or separate, and it created exactly that, a state within a state, answerable only to Ivan's personal will. The Oprichnina encompassed roughly half of Russian territory, including the most prosperous regions and strategically important cities. Within these lands, Ivan ruled through the Oprichniki, a corps of specially chosen enforcers who swore personal loyalty to the Tsar and were authorized to use any means necessary to eliminate his enemies. The Oprichniki were easily recognizable by their distinctive symbols and dress. They wore black robes and rode black horses, carrying brooms and dog heads attached to their saddles to symbolize their mission of sweeping away traitors and biting the Tsar's enemies like faithful hounds. These men came from various social backgrounds, but were united by their absolute loyalty to Ivan and their willingness to commit any atrocity in his name. They formed a brotherhood of terror that operated outside traditional law and custom. The establishment of the Oprichnina coincided with a dramatic escalation in Ivan's use of systematic terror as an instrument of state policy. Unlike the occasional executions and banishments of his earlier reign, the Oprichnina created an institutionalized system of surveillance, denunciation, and punishment that reached into every corner of Russian society. No one was safe from accusation, and the mere suspicion of disloyalty could result in confiscation of property, torture, exile, or death. Ivan personally supervised the Oprichnina's reign of terror from his fortified residence at Alexandrova Sloboda, which he transformed into a bizarre parody of a monastery. The Tsar and his Oprichniki followed a daily schedule of religious services, communal meals, and administrative meetings that resembled monastic life, but interspersed with sessions of torture, execution, and debauchery that mocked Christian values. Ivan styled himself as the abbot of this unholy brotherhood, leading prayers for the souls of the men he had ordered killed. The victims of Oprichnina terror included members of the oldest and most distinguished boyar families, many of whom had served the Moscow princes faithfully for generations. The Tsaritsa family, Ivan's own cousins and potential rivals for the throne, were systematically eliminated through poison, execution, and forced suicide. Prince Vladimir Streltsy, who had been Ivan's childhood companion, was compelled to drink a cup of poison while the Tsar watched approvingly. The Metropolitan Philip, head of the Russian Orthodox Church and formerly one of Ivan's supporters, courageously condemned the Oprichnina's atrocities and called for Christian mercy and justice. His reward was a deposition from office and exile to a remote monastery, where he was murdered by Oprichniki, who strangled him with his own clerical vestments. The killing of Russia's highest religious leader demonstrated that no institution could restrain Ivan's increasingly uncontrolled exercise of power. The economic impact of the Oprichnina was catastrophic for Russia. The constant confiscation of boyar estates and the redistribution of land to Oprichniki supporters disrupted agricultural production and trade networks that had taken generations to develop. Skilled administrators and experienced military commanders fled the country or were eliminated, leaving critical positions unfilled. The arbitrary nature of Oprichnina justice made long-term planning impossible, as no one could predict which policies or officials might suddenly fall from favor. Foreign observers were horrified by reports of the Oprichnina's activities. English merchants who had established trading relationships with Russia during Ivan's earlier reign found their businesses disrupted by the chaos and unpredictability of the terror. European diplomats reported back to their governments that the Russian Tsar had become a dangerous madman whose actions violated every principle of Christian kingship and effective governance. The Oprichnina's methods of torture and execution became increasingly elaborate and sadistic as Ivan's paranoia deepened. Victims were subjected to prolonged agonies designed to extract confessions of treasonous activities, but also simply to satisfy the Tsar's growing appetite for inflicting pain. Mass executions became public spectacles, with Ivan personally participating in the killings while forcing his courtiers to watch and applaud his actions. The terror extended beyond individual victims to their families and associates. Wives and children of accused traitors were often killed or enslaved, while friends and servants faced suspicion and punishment for their associations with the condemned. This collective responsibility created an atmosphere of universal fear, where normal social relationships became dangerous, as anyone might be compelled to denounce their neighbors, relatives, or employers to save themselves. Ivan's written correspondence during the Oprichnina years reveals a man increasingly detached from reality, justifying the most extreme cruelties through elaborate theological and historical arguments. He compared himself to biblical kings who had destroyed the enemies of God's chosen people, and cited examples from Roman and Byzantine history of emperors who had preserved their realms through necessary harshness. These scholarly rationalizations masked a descent into systematic sadism that would make his name synonymous with tyranny. The Oprichnina created its own internal dynamics of terror, as Oprichniki competed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly extreme acts of violence and cruelty. Those who showed any hesitation or mercy toward victims could themselves become suspects, creating a spiral of escalating brutality that consumed both perpetrators and victims. The organization became a machine for generating fear that operated according to its own terrible logic rather than any rational state policy. By 1571, the Oprichnina had so weakened Russia that foreign enemies were emboldened to launch devastating attacks on the realm Ivan claimed to be protecting. The Crimean Tatars, observing the chaos and military deterioration caused by the terror, launched a massive raid that reached Moscow itself, burning much of the city and carrying away tens of thousands of captives. The Oprichnina forces, despite their fearsome reputation against defenseless civilians, proved ineffective against actual military opponents. The winter of 1569 to 1570 witnessed one of the most horrific episodes in Russian history, when Ivan, convinced that the ancient city of Novgorod was plotting to defect to Lithuania, unleashed the full fury of the Oprichnina against its population. The massacre that followed would become a defining moment of Ivan's reign and a permanent stain on his historical legacy, demonstrating how completely paranoia and unchecked power had corrupted the once promising young reformer. The roots of Ivan's suspicion toward Novgorod lay in the city's unique history and character. Unlike Moscow, which had grown through princely autocracy, Novgorod had developed as a merchant republic with traditions of self-governance and independence. Though conquered by Ivan's grandfather in 1478, the city retained a distinct cultural identity and commercial orientation that made it seem foreign and potentially disloyal to the increasingly paranoid Tsar. Its prosperity, built on trade connections with European markets, aroused both Ivan's envy and his suspicion. The immediate trigger for Ivan's action was a forged document purporting to prove that Novgorod's leaders were negotiating with the King of Poland-Lithuania to transfer the city's allegiance in exchange for guarantees of traditional privileges. Modern historians have established that the document was almost certainly fabricated by Ivan's enemies at court, who sought to destroy their rivals by misdirecting the Tsar's paranoia toward distant targets. But Ivan, already predisposed to suspect treason everywhere, accepted the forgery as genuine evidence of a massive conspiracy against his rule. Ivan's preparations for the Novgorod expedition revealed the systematic and premeditated nature of what followed. Unlike his earlier military campaigns, which had specific strategic objectives, this operation was planned as a punitive expedition designed to terrorize the population into absolute submission. The force assembled was not a conventional army, but rather a collection of Oprichniki, specially selected for their willingness to commit atrocities against civilians. The Tsar also brought along extensive torture equipment and execution devices, indicating his intention to conduct mass killings. The expedition departed Moscow in December 1569, moving through the Russian countryside like a plague. Towns and villages along the route were systematically pillaged, their populations subjected to torture and execution on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Monasteries were particular targets, as Ivan suspected the clergy of harboring treasonous sympathies. The famous monastery of St. Philip was attacked, and its abbot murdered after refusing to provide information about alleged conspiracies. The Oprichniki behaved more like foreign invaders than representatives of their own sovereign, destroying the economic and social fabric of regions they passed through. The siege of Novgorod began in early January 1570, but this was no ordinary military operation. Instead of surrounding the city to force surrender, Ivan's forces systematically isolated different quarters and subjected their inhabitants to organized massacres. Men, women, and children were herded into churches and marketplaces where they were tortured for confessions of treason before being executed. The methods of killing were deliberately chosen for their cruelty and psychological impact. Victims were burned, drowned, dismembered, and subjected to sexual violence designed to terrorize survivors. Ivan personally supervised much of the killing, reportedly taking pleasure in devising new forms of torture and execution. Contemporary accounts describe him ordering victims to be sewn into bearskins and then torn apart by hunting dogs, or having families thrown into the freezing Volkhov River after holes were cut in the ice. The Tsar kept detailed records of the executions, later claiming that over 60,000 people had been killed, though modern estimates suggest the actual number was between 3,000 and 15,000. Still an enormous toll for a medieval city. The economic destruction was as systematic as the human slaughter. Novgorod's warehouses were looted, its trade goods confiscated, and its commercial records destroyed. The city's famous workshops, which had produced luxury items for European markets, were dismantled and their craftsmen killed or enslaved. The systematic destruction of Novgorod's economic infrastructure ensured that even survivors would face starvation and poverty for years to come. Religious institutions received particular attention during the massacre, as Ivan seemed determined to destroy not just the city's population, but its spiritual and cultural identity. Churches were looted and desecrated, religious artifacts stolen or destroyed, and clergy tortured for alleged political crimes. The magnificent Cathedral of St. Sophia, symbol of Novgorod's independence and Orthodox faith, was vandalized and stripped of its treasures. Holy relics that had been venerated for centuries were scattered or burned. The psychological warfare employed during the Novgorod massacre was as important as the physical violence. Ivan forced survivors to participate in the executions of their neighbors and relatives, breaking down social bonds and collective resistance through complicity in atrocities. Children were made to watch their parents' deaths, while parents were compelled to witness their children's torture. These tactics were designed to create lasting trauma that would prevent any future rebellion against royal authority. The international reaction to the Novgorod massacre was one of horror and condemnation. European merchants who had traded with the city carried news of the atrocities throughout the continent, damaging Russia's reputation and diplomatic relationships. The Pope condemned Ivan as a tyrant worse than the Ottoman Sultan, while Protestant leaders cited the massacre as evidence of Orthodox Christianity's corruption. These denunciations isolated Russia diplomatically at a time when the country desperately needed foreign allies. The domestic impact of the massacre was equally devastating for Ivan's rule. The destruction of Novgorod eliminated one of Russia's most important commercial centers, reducing tax revenues and disrupting trade networks throughout the realm. The arbitrary and extreme nature of the punishment created fear among all of Ivan's subjects, as no city or region could feel secure from similar treatment. The massacre demonstrated that the Tsar's paranoia had reached levels that threatened the survival of the Russian state itself. Even among the Oprichniki, the Novgorod massacre created unease and revulsion. Some of Ivan's most loyal enforcers were reportedly disturbed by the scale and cruelty of the killings, recognizing that they had participated in something that went beyond political necessity into pure sadism. This internal dissatisfaction within the Oprichnina would contribute to Ivan's eventual decision to dissolve the organization, though not before more atrocities had been committed. The massacre of Novgorod marked the complete transformation of Ivan from a legitimate monarch into a tyrant whose primary relationship with his subjects was based on fear rather than loyalty or respect. The young Tsar, who had once dreamed of creating a just and prosperous Russia, had become a monster whose actions threatened the very survival of the civilization he claimed to protect. The massacre would haunt Ivan for the remainder of his life and establish his reputation as one of history's most cruel and destructive rulers. On the evening of November 16th, 1581, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Ivan committed the act that would haunt him for the remaining years of his life and cement his reputation as a tyrant consumed by madness. In his private chambers within the Kremlin, the 61-year-old Tsar struck down his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with the iron-pointed staff he carried everywhere as both walking stick and weapon. The young prince, 27 years old and the father of 2 children, died 3 days later from his head wound, leaving Russia without a capable heir and his father consumed by remorse that would torment him until his own death. The immediate cause of the fatal confrontation was typical of the increasingly frequent clashes between father and son over Ivan's erratic and destructive policies. The younger Ivan, known for his intelligence, military skill, and genuine concern for Russia's welfare, had been growing increasingly bold in challenging his father's decisions. On that fatal November evening, the dispute concerned the ongoing Livonian War, which had dragged on for over 20 years and was bleeding Russia of men and resources without achieving any strategic objectives. Prince Ivan had argued passionately that the war should be ended through negotiated settlement, pointing out that continued fighting was bankrupting the treasury and devastating the countryside. He had also criticized his father's treatment of military commanders, many of whom had been executed on suspicion of the treason despite their loyal service. The young prince's arguments were reasonable and well-informed, but they struck Ivan the Terrible as evidence of disloyalty and lack of respect for royal authority. The confrontation escalated when the younger Ivan defended his pregnant wife, who had been criticized by the Tsar for her informal dress within the palace. When Ivan the Terrible berated his daughter-in-law for appearing before him in what he considered inappropriate attire, his son intervened to protect her honor. This act of filial duty was interpreted by the paranoid Tsar as defiance of his absolute authority over all members of the royal family. What followed was a typical explosion of Ivan's ungovernable temper, but with consequences more terrible than any of his previous rages. Screaming accusations of treason and ingratitude, the Tsar raised his iron staff and struck his son on the temple with such force that the young man collapsed immediately, blood streaming from his head wound. The blow was delivered with the full strength of a man, driven by fury and madness, showing no consideration for the victim's identity as his beloved heir. The immediate aftermath of the assault revealed the full horror of what Ivan had done. As his son lay bleeding on the floor, the Tsar's rage instantly transformed into panic and desperate remorse. He fell to his knees beside the wounded prince, attempting to stanch the blood flow with his own hands while crying out for physicians and priests. The man who had coldly ordered thousands of executions was suddenly faced with the consequences of his violence applied to someone he genuinely loved. For 3 agonizing days, Ivan maintained a vigil beside his dying son's bedside, praying frantically for divine forgiveness and medical intervention that never came. The finest physicians in Moscow worked desperately to save the prince, but the head wound was too severe for the medical knowledge of the time. The younger Ivan drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing his father and offering forgiveness that only increased the Tsar's anguish. Court observers reported that Ivan the Terrible aged years during those 3 days, his hair turning completely white as he watched his heir's life ebb away. The death of Prince Ivan on November 19th, 1581, created both a personal and dynastic crisis that would have profound consequences for Russia's future. Personally, it shattered the Tsar's remaining mental stability and consumed him with guilt that would dominate his final years. Dynastically, it left Russia with Fyodor, Ivan's younger son, who was pious and gentle, but intellectually limited and completely unsuited for the demands of ruling an enormous empire. The succession crisis that would follow Ivan's death could be traced directly to this moment of uncontrolled violence. The psychological impact on Ivan was immediately apparent to everyone at court. The Tsar, who had shown no remorse for ordering mass executions, was destroyed by the death of his son. He stopped eating regularly, neglected state business, and spent hours in prayer and self-flagellation. The man who had always dressed magnificently now wore simple robes and refused to allow his hair or beard to be properly groomed. His physical deterioration was so rapid that foreign ambassadors reported he looked like a man 20 years older than his actual age. Ivan's grief manifested in elaborate attempts to honor his dead son's memory and atone for his crime. He established multiple monasteries and churches dedicated to Prince Ivan's soul, donating enormous sums to ensure continuous prayers for the young man's salvation. He commissioned magnificent tomb monuments and endowed charitable institutions in his son's name. But no amount of posthumous honors could restore the life he had destroyed or ease the burden of his guilt. The political consequences of Prince Ivan's death extended far beyond the immediate succession crisis. The younger Ivan had been widely respected by the nobility, military commanders, and common people as a potential ruler who might restore stability and competent governance to Russia. His death eliminated the possibility of a peaceful transition to a more rational regime and condemned Russia to continued rule by an increasingly unstable tyrant, followed by a weak and incompetent successor. Foreign powers immediately recognized the strategic implications of Prince Ivan's death. The succession crisis that would inevitably follow Ivan the Terrible's death became a factor in European diplomatic calculations, with various powers positioning themselves to exploit Russian weakness. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Sweden, and other neighbors began planning for potential territorial gains during the chaos that might follow Ivan's death. The personal tragedy also affected Ivan's relationship with his surviving son Fyodor, who became heir to the throne despite his obvious unfitness for rule. Ivan alternated between desperate attempts to prepare Fyodor for kingship and bitter disappointment at the young man's limitations. The contrast between the capable son he had killed and the inadequate son who survived became another source of torment for the guilt-ridden Tsar. Court life became increasingly gloomy and unpredictable after Prince Ivan's death. The Tsar's mood swings became more extreme, alternating between periods of deep depression and explosive anger. Officials never knew whether they would encounter a grieving father seeking comfort or a dangerous tyrant ready to lash out at anyone who reminded him of his loss. The administrative efficiency that had characterized Ivan's early reign completely collapsed as the Tsar became unable to focus on governance. The famous painting by Ilya Repin, created centuries later, would capture the essential horror of this moment. Ivan the Terrible, cradling his dying son, his eyes wide with the realization of what he has done, blood on his hands and despair written across his features. Though created by an artist who lived long after the events, the painting perfectly conveyed the psychological truth of Ivan's greatest crime: the destruction of his own dynasty through uncontrolled violence. The death of Prince Ivan marked the beginning of the end of Ivan the Terrible's effective rule. The man who had once dreamed of creating a great Russian empire had become a broken figure haunted by guilt and remorse. The remaining 3 years of his life would be dominated by his attempts to cope with the consequences of his most terrible act, while Russia drifted toward the chaos and instability that would characterize the time of troubles following his death. The final years of Ivan's reign, from 1581 to 1584, witnessed the gradual collapse of both the Tsar's mental health and the state he had spent his lifetime building. The death of his heir had broken something fundamental in Ivan's psyche, transforming him from a tyrant driven by paranoid purpose into a guilt-ridden shadow consumed by regret and despair. The man who had once commanded absolute terror now inspired only pity and revulsion, even among those who had served him faithfully through decades of brutality. In the months following Prince Ivan's death, the Tsar's physical deterioration became as dramatic as his mental decline. His once imposing frame became gaunt and bent, his famous piercing eyes grew dull and sunken, and his hands developed a constant tremor that made writing difficult. Court physicians whispered about strange ailments that seemed to be consuming their sovereign from within. Sudden fevers, mysterious pains, and episodes of delirium that suggested either divine punishment or slow poisoning by unknown enemies. Ivan's attempts to cope with his guilt took increasingly desperate and bizarre forms. He established a new monastery at Alexandrova Sloboda, specifically to pray for his son's soul, requiring all his courtiers to participate in elaborate funeral services that were repeated weekly. The Tsar would prostrate himself before icons for hours, beating his head against the stone floors until blood flowed, while chanting confessions of his sins in a voice that had become weak and cracked with age and grief. The practical business of governing Russia became secondary to Ivan's obsession with his spiritual salvation. He spent enormous sums commissioning religious artwork depicting the torments of hell and the fate of murderers, surrounding himself with visual reminders of divine judgment that only deepened his psychological torment. Foreign ambassadors reported that audiences with the Tsar had become surreal experiences, as Ivan would interrupt diplomatic discussions to confess his crimes and beg for prayers for his son's soul. The Oprichnina, which had terrorized Russia for 7 years, was officially dissolved in 1572, but not from any moral awakening on Ivan's part. Rather, the organization had become militarily ineffective and politically counterproductive, failing to protect Russia from foreign invasion while destroying the internal unity needed for successful defense. The Crimean Tatar raid of 1571, which had burned Moscow while Oprichniki forces stood helplessly by, had demonstrated the ultimate futility of terror as a basis for state power. But even without the formal structure of the Oprichnina, Ivan's capacity for violence remained undiminished. The executions continued, though they became more random and less systematic than during the organized terror of the 1560s. The Tsar's paranoia now focused on different targets: foreign merchants suspected of espionage, Orthodox clergy accused of insufficient loyalty, and court officials who might be plotting to hasten his death and place Fyodor on the throne. The Livonian War, which had consumed Russian resources for over 20 years, finally ground to a humiliating conclusion during these final years. The Treaty of Jam-Zapolsky in 1582 forced Ivan to abandon all his conquests in the Baltic region, returning territorial control to Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, while gaining nothing in exchange for decades of warfare and enormous human sacrifice. The strategic objective that had originally justified the war, secure access to European trade routes, remained as elusive as ever. Ivan's relationship with his surviving son, Fyodor, became a source of constant frustration and renewed guilt. The gentle, pious young man bore no resemblance to the dynamic prince who had died under his father's hand, and Ivan alternated between desperate attempts to strengthen Fyodor's character and bitter acceptance that his heir was fundamentally unsuited for the demands of absolute rule. Court observers noted that Ivan sometimes stared at Fyodor with an expression of profound sadness, as if seeing in his surviving son everything he had lost when he killed Prince Ivan. The Tsar's efforts to secure the succession extended beyond simply preparing Fyodor for rule. He negotiated potential marriage alliances that might provide his weak son with powerful foreign support, while simultaneously attempting to eliminate domestic rivals who might challenge Fyodor's authority after his death. The systematic murder of potential claimants to the throne became one of Ivan's final obsessions, as he sought to clear the path for his inadequate heir through the same violent methods that had characterized his entire reign. Foreign policy during these final years reflected Russia's internal decay and Ivan's diminished capacity for strategic thinking. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals a ruler increasingly detached from reality, making grandiose claims about Russian power while the actual military and economic foundations of that power crumbled. European ambassadors learned to humor the aging Tsar's delusions while quietly negotiating with his advisors about the practical details of international relations. The cultural and intellectual life that had flourished during Ivan's early reign virtually disappeared during these final years. Scholars and artists fled the country or remained silent to avoid attracting the Tsar's unpredictable attention. The printing press, which had produced important works during the 1550s and 1560s, fell into disuse as censorship and paranoia made intellectual activity dangerous. The Renaissance influences that had begun to modernize Russian culture were overwhelmed by a return to medieval isolation and suspicion of foreign ideas. Economic conditions throughout Russia deteriorated dramatically as Ivan's reign approached its end. The combination of prolonged warfare, internal terror, and administrative chaos had disrupted trade networks and agricultural production throughout the realm. Tax revenues declined as depopulation reduced the number of productive subjects, while military expenses continued to consume enormous resources despite the lack of strategic success. Contemporary accounts describe vast areas of formerly prosperous countryside that had been abandoned by their inhabitants, creating a demographic crisis that would persist long after Ivan's death. The Tsar's personal life became increasingly bizarre and isolated. He married his seventh wife, Maria Nagaya, in 1580, but the relationship was troubled by his guilt over previous marriages and his growing belief that all his personal relationships were cursed by divine judgment. When Maria gave birth to a son, Dmitri, in 1582, Ivan was torn between hope for a new heir and fear that this child, too, might be destroyed by his sins. Religious advisors who attempted to counsel Ivan during these final years found themselves dealing with a man whose faith had become twisted by guilt and paranoia. The Tsar's theological understanding, which had once been sophisticated and scholarly, devolved into obsessive focus on divine retribution and the impossibility of redemption for his crimes. He commissioned increasingly elaborate funeral preparations for himself while still alive, designing a tomb that would serve as a permanent monument to his failures as both ruler and father. The physical symptoms that had begun appearing after Prince Ivan's death intensified during 1583 and early 1584. Ivan suffered from severe joint pain that made movement difficult, mysterious internal ailments that caused him to lose weight dramatically, and episodes of mental confusion that left him unable to recognize familiar faces or remember recent events. Modern medical analysis of his remains would later suggest that he may have been suffering from syphilis, mercury poisoning from attempted medical treatments, or simple physical breakdown from decades of stress and violence. On March 18th, 1584, Ivan the Terrible died while playing chess with one of his few remaining courtiers. According to witnesses, he collapsed suddenly after moving a piece, his body convulsing briefly before falling still. His death was as abrupt and dramatic as his life had been, bringing to an end one of the most remarkable and terrible reigns in Russian history. He was 53 years old and had ruled Russia for 37 years, transforming it from a medieval principality into a vast empire, while also establishing a legacy of brutality that would haunt the Russian political tradition for centuries. The immediate reaction to Ivan's death revealed the complex and contradictory feelings his reign had inspired among his subjects. While many Russians felt relief that the reign of terror had finally ended, others worried about the uncertain succession and the foreign enemies who might exploit Russia's weakness. The elaborate funeral ceremonies reflected both genuine grief for a ruler who had expanded Russian territory and influence, and profound anxiety about what his legacy meant for the future of the realm he had created. Ivan's body was interred in the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael within the Kremlin, where it joined the remains of his ancestors and the son he had murdered. His tomb became both a monument to Russian imperial ambition and a warning about the dangers of absolute power unchecked by law or conscience. The inscription on his sarcophagus proclaimed him Tsar of All Russia, but history would remember him by the epithet he had earned through his cruelties, Ivan the Terrible, the ruler who had demonstrated both the potential for greatness and the capacity for evil that lay within the Russian autocratic tradition. The legacy Ivan left behind was as complex and contradictory as the man himself. He had expanded Russian territory from approximately 930,000 square miles to over 1.5 million square miles, establishing the foundation for the vast Russian empire that would dominate Eurasia for centuries. He had created administrative and military institutions that would serve as models for his successors, while establishing the principle of absolute monarchy that would define Russian political culture. But he had also demonstrated how completely such power could corrupt its possessor, turning a promising young reformer into a monster whose cruelties shocked even his brutal age. The time of troubles that followed Ivan's death, a period of civil war, foreign invasion, and social chaos that lasted until 1613, seemed like divine retribution for the sins of his reign. Russia would eventually recover and grow even more powerful under the Romanov dynasty, but the memory of Ivan the Terrible would remain as both inspiration and warning for future rulers. He had shown that Russia could become a great empire, but also that the price of greatness, when paid in the blood of innocent subjects, might ultimately prove too high for any nation to bear. Ivan Vasilievich, first Tsar of all Russia, died as he had lived, alone, feared, and haunted by the consequences of his choices. His reign had lasted longer than most and achieved more than many, but it had also revealed the fundamental tragedy of absolute power, that those who wield it without restraint ultimately destroy not only their enemies, but themselves and everything they claim to love. The terrible Tsar's greatest victory The creation of the Russian Empire was also his greatest defeat, for he had built it on foundations of fear and blood that would never provide lasting stability or genuine prosperity for the people he had claimed to serve.